So now that we've got our character animation wrapped up, let's move on and take a look at our audience's animation. Now, the audience's animation is going to take place in two parts. The first is going to be setting up our audience look at, so that the audience sort of look at where our character is. And the second, in the next video, is going to deal with the actual squash and stretch animation of the audience.
That's right. Now, having the audience look at the character is going to pose an interesting problem, and that is if we were to just simply link up the look at for our audience so that it was truly watching our character is bouncing, doing, doing,
Yeah.
doing, and the audience is going to go doing, doing.
Yeah, they're
basically.
going to keep looking up and down, and it's going to feel weird, because if you're an audience watching a performance at a distance, you're not going to follow that kind of minute detail. You're kind of roughly going to follow where the character's moving, and when he climbs the ladder, you'll look up to follow him, but you're not going to follow those bounces. Also,
yeah, the going up the ladder would be pretty funny if we were to link it through directly, because they'd basically lean back forward a tad bit, back forward a tad bit, back forward a tad bit. That'd just look really funny.
And also, when the character climbs to the top of the ladder, if the audience were to actually look up at that level, it's possible they'll be looking up too far and leaning back too far. If we take the translate Y of our audience look at and control it manually, we now have complete control over how far back the audience look.
Excellent.
So what we're going to do, we're going to link up our null that the audience are looking at so that it follows the character in translate X exactly, but we're going to animate translate Y manually. Fantastic. So let's jump up to object level and zoom out. And we're space 1 to go over to a perspective view. I'm going to bring in our bleachers so we can see our audience. I'm going to grab our audience look at null. So currently the audience are looking at this guy down here, and we took care when we set up the layout at the end of the first volume, we took care to make sure that we accounted for the translation with our offsets and everything, so they are indeed looking at this exact position. So I'm going to extend our animation and jump to around frame 250, which is where our character's about to start. And what we can do, we can take our audience look at, and let's set its translate X to reference our character's position in X. So let's enter CH, grab our character, and grab his TX parameter. So you can see our null is following along with the character. I'm just going to hide out the bleachers so we actually get some nice feedback in the viewport. Now as our character moves, our null is going to follow with the character in X. Now in Y, we can take the null and we can position it approximately where the character is in Y, but it allows us to, when the character is bouncing here, we can simply ignore the bounce animation and keep a nice steady translate Y value. Then as he climbs the ladder, we can approximate that value, pushing to the maximum to see like how far back the audience are going to go, and call that as a maximum. So let's bring back our bleachers so that we can see where they're currently looking. And let's key our translate Y just as the character's about to start climbing up the ladder. So round about there looks good to me. So I'm going to Alt left click on translate Y to create a key on the translate Y for the audience look at. And we do have auto key on, so now if we're to move the null, we'll create a keyframe. And once the character has climbed to the top of the ladder, around a little bit further from here, I think it's around 440 or so. So once the character has climbed to the top of the ladder, we can move our null up, and we'll be able to see the audience look back up at the null. And you can see if we were to push this all the way to where the character is, the audience are really leaning back way too far. I mean, that just doesn't look right.
It's actually pretty funny.
So what we can do is we can take the null and we can still move it up in Y so the audience lean back and it will give an impression that they're watching the character, but in actuality they can be just looking at an area around here. So let's take our null and move it down to around the midpoint. That's probably too far. Let me turn off the bleachers so I can actually get nice feedback and then turn them back on. So now the audience are looking up, but they're not looking up so far that it's ridiculous. And also bearing in mind that our camera angle is going to be around here. If you recall the storyboards, when the character is up here, the audience are going to be looked at from above, so we could even push it a little bit further. Let's hide out our bleachers so we get some feedback, and then bring the bleachers back in. So yeah, something like that. They've definitely moved position. If we were to go back to where they were originally looking at, they've definitely changed in terms of their position enough that the audience watching your animation is going to think that this audience is watching the character.
Sure.
But
it'll give that illusion.
Yeah, but not so far that these guys are almost horizontal. So our character moves up to the top of the diving board. Let's hide out the bleachers. So now we've got a good reference for where we want our translate Y to be. Now as the character jumps up to the top of this jump, for these jumps I do want the audience to follow a little bit because these are important jumps, whereas the jumps here, just getting the character from A to B, these are kind of the most important jumps in the piece because they're leading up the build-up to that final dive. So I do want the audience to follow slightly what's going on here. So let's key our translate Y. And then as the character jumps up, move very subtly. And that's going to auto key. And as the character moves back down, we can move down very slightly. As the character moves up very slightly. So it will almost be so subtle that you won't notice, but it will add just an extra little bit of secondary animation that will be felt more than seen. As the character moves up, back down. For this jump I will push it a little bit further because that is the peak of the main jump. So let's push it just a tad further. And then as the character comes all the way back down to being in the pool, so on that frame we will move this all the way down to being in the pool. So with that, if we were to watch back, just watching the null as it follows the character, we can see that we approximate the character's motion enough that the audience will appear to be watching the character, but we haven't pushed it so far that the audience are going to lean back a ridiculous amount. We do need to tweak our translate Y at the end there so that we maybe slow down on our acceleration. So I'm going to shift middle click the translate Y parameter H to home up. And let's grab this tangent handle, untie, and give things more of the animation curve that our character actually has. I'm happy for it to be smooth motion here because I don't want jerky motion on the audience, but this definitely needs to be an acceleration that follows with the character. So hopefully this will better match the character's motion. Yeah, I'm much happier with that. Fantastic. The last thing I do want to check is as the character is at its peak, this is the highest the audience are going to be looking at. I just want to make sure that it's not a ridiculous amount. It's quite far, but again, bearing in mind that the camera angle is going to be high up so it doesn't look too crazy. So yeah, I mean with that, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's pretty much going to wrap everything up.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.